In Lunarchitects, players are employees of an architecture firm tasked to design the first moon base. While they are co-workers and will be using blueprints from a common pool of blueprint tiles on the conference room table, players are designing their own moon base in front of them and competing to be the most profitable or having the most points at the end. Points are collected throughout the game by using the buildings in their moon base and collecting crystals, rockets, and special red tiles. Over the course of the game, players will be moving their player pawns around the blueprint queue 4 times and getting points for their scoring items each time. After the 4th lap, final scores are calculated and the winner is declared. Unlike most games, the player whose turn it is does not go around the table. In Lunarchitects, the player whose pawn is furthest back in the queue goes next. When it's your turn, you take your player pawn, move it as far forward in the blueprint queue as you'd like, and take a tile. Then you add a tile to the front of the queue so there's always one space open. You'll go through all the tiles by the end of the game. I mentioned you can move as far forward as you'd like, but because your turn comes when you're the furthest back in the queue, if you move further forward, say to take a more powerful tile, it'll be a longer time before it's your turn again. And because you can only activate buildings during your turn, having more turns is generally better. More about the blueprint tiles. When you choose and take a tile from the queue, you'll be placing it in your moon base plan in front of you. You connect it to your initial headquarters to start. I'll get to the steps of placing a tile in a second. First, let's look at the things on the tile. On the left and right sides of the building tiles are the resource icons. On the left is the cost you have to pay in order to place it in your base using resources you've generated on your tiles. On the right is stuff you'll get once, right when you build it, often points or scoring items. At the bottom is the main function of the building. It shows what the tile does every time it's activated. How does a tile get activated? Well, whenever you place a tile, you activate that tile and every tile you're building next to. In this way, you're always activating multiple tiles in a turn. Sometimes you're activating a bunch of tiles to chain beneficial actions. It's like a little engine builder in that way. Many of the tiles generate resources, like other Euro games. In our case, there are 4 resources: air and water, which are made with purifiers and distillers, food, made from biomes, and rock, made from mines. Generally, food is converted to points, and rock is used to make crystals, one of the scoring items. When resources are generated, put them right on the tile that generated it. Crystals and rockets you can put with your points. Back to the tiles. At the top is the name of the building. When the tile is placed, the name always has to be at the top. On many, there's also a symbol next to the name, but that isn't important until mid-game, so don't worry about it now. In the picture is often an inter-building connection. This must be maintained when you place it. For instance, this tube has to be connected to another tube, and the rail has to be connected to a rail. You can't end a rail or tube, and you can't start a new set of rail or tubes. In the beginning, tiles without connections have to be connected directly above or directly below your starting tile. The big requirement for placing a tile is you always have to build next to an astronaut. Astronauts are not resources, but they'll be moving and living in your simulated moon base. You'll always need an astronaut nearby to oversee the construction of a new building. Now I can point out the symbol on the starting quarters. This is a move astronaut action. It allows you to move any one astronaut, not just the one on the tile that's activating, from one tile to an adjacent tile. So, as you can imagine, as your base gets bigger, your astronauts will be moving outward, working at the edges. But do you see the red up arrow? That reminds you that instead of moving an astronaut from one tile to another, instead you can launch him into space as an explorer and take a rocket and set it with your points. Remember, rockets are one of the other scoring items that give you points throughout the game. A little more detail on that. I mentioned that the game lasts 4 laps around the tile queue. Each time all player pawns have crossed the lap line, the game pauses for a second while players score, according to the lap scoring scheme. For first-timers, when scoring the lap, you just count up your rockets, crystals, and red tiles, and you take 1 point for each. You don't return these items, you keep them, and you can score them again next lap. So in essence, if you get a crystal or rocket before the first scoring, it'll score you 4 points by the end of the game. If you get them later, they end up being around for fewer lap scorings, so they score you less. Once the lap scoring is done, you just resume right where you left off. There's no resets or anything. It's just a time you get points. After all players have completed their 4th lap and scored it, final scoring occurs. There are always 2 aspects to final scoring, and for first-timers, the 2 printed give points for completely surrounding tiles and for having none of a scoring item. For instance, if at the end of the game you don't have any rockets, you score 8 points. If you have no crystals, you score 8 points. If you have no rockets and no crystals, you score 16 points. It's a nice way to let those who never end up with the scoring items, or those who can manage to get rid of them, score some extra points at the end. One note on the queue. When you play with 2 or 3 players, there just aren't enough people around the conference room table, and Spot the dog just keeps stealing blueprints off the table. When Spot is last in the queue, you roll the die and move him forward that many spaces, just like a player, and the tile he lands on goes to the box. His faces are 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, so he won't jump very far, but I promise, at least once, he'll take a tile you really wanted just before your turn. The last feature of this game is the internal exchange. It's a little closed market system that allows players who don't get a particular resource to still potentially use that resource when purchasing. When it's your turn and you have to pay a cost through either a building cost or an effect cost, instead of paying it with a resource from one of your tiles, you can put a stack of your points onto the cheapest spot on that resource, and then it's considered paid. But on a player's turn, that player could sell that resource to take the most expensive stack. So while you could choose to never get a distiller and always buy the water from the resource exchange, either you'll max it out and not be able to buy more later, or you'll let another player make a lot of points off his or her water. A note for space allocation. There are no ways to remove tiles, and by the end you'll have built between 12 and 20 tiles. Often they'll stretch left-right more than up-down, so keep that in mind when setting up the table. A couple strategic points for first-timers. The tiles themselves are going to come out randomly, but they're staged into initial, what you see here, early, mid, and late game tiles. Like most Euro games, the early game is about establishing a resource generating groundwork and maybe getting an extra astronaut, maybe some starts to an early engine, but the tiles are generally cheap. Mid-game, things start to get more interesting with tiles that give you points for specific resources, or maybe potentially activating additional tiles. They do start to get more costly though. By the end, tiles are mostly about getting points. They're going to be pretty powerful, but frequently they're specific or expensive. Final scores do depend on the number of players, but often players will get a third of their total score in the last couple of turns. But as I mentioned, the early stuff is pretty much all good. Especially for the first few turns, there's very little reason to skip tiles, as you'll just be giving other players fractionally more turns than you, and that'll add up by the end. And because everything is good and universally useful at the beginning, it's pretty hard to mess up early. Strategies can shift mid-game if you see an opening, so don't fret if you're not sure what you're doing for the first couple of turns. That's about all you need to know to be dangerous, so feel free and get started. Any icons or effects that I haven't talked about should be explained in the player reference on the back of the rulebook, so check that out. Overall, thanks and enjoy Lunarchitects.